You are in the ladies' room with Dr. Donica, the only public ladies' room you can enter anytime without ever waiting online. I'm your host, Dr. Donica Moore. We'll be having real conversations with real women about really intimate issues. They may be embarrassing, sad, or funny, but they will always be interesting and informative. You know, like the best conversations you've had in ladies' rooms with your best friends, or total strangers and a physician. Please join us. Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. Today, we are going to talk about something that I'm getting lots and lots of emails about, and that is anxiety. Every third or fourth email I get from listeners is talking about tremendous anxiety that they've been feeling for the past year or two. And of course, all you have to do is watch the news for an hour on any given day, and you'll see why it's no surprise that a new study reveals that 96% of American women are suffering from anxiety to a certain extent. Now, this study of more than 1,000 women comes from Women's Day magazine in partnership with Healthy Women, a leading independent nonprofit health information source for women. It addressed women's attitudes toward anxiety, what triggers their anxiety, and how they manage it. The full results appeared in the September issue of Women's Day, which you can still find online in perpetuity. Now, what did the results show? 96% of participants revealed that they've experienced some level of anxiety, with 81% suffering from it at least weekly. Additional survey findings included that over 61% of women have experienced a panic attack at some point, and we'll talk about this later, what a panic attack actually is. 43% of women have not spoken to their healthcare professional about their concerns, even though it interferes with their activities of daily life. Those surveyed also cited age as a factor in their anxiety, revealing that they experienced more anxiety in their 40s, 50s, and 60s than they did in their 20s and 30s. Although I suspect maybe we don't remember how much anxiety we experienced in our 20s and 30s. Financial concerns were identified as the leading cause of anxiety in more than half of respondents. And then anxiety triggers number 2 and 3, no surprise, were situations at work at 44% and relationships with your significant other, 35%. So we're also going to talk about what coping mechanisms women say they turn to when they start to feel anxious. And then we're also going to talk about which ones you should preferentially turn to. But 44% of women said they dealt with their anxiety by watching TV. In my case, that causes anxiety. 41% turned to food. 33% avoid social situations. And 33% exercise. So kudos to them. Now, interestingly, 87% of the women surveyed have already gone through menopause. So this is a very specific sample group, or they're currently perimenopausal. And 80% believe that menopause can cause anxiety. And this is what we're going to focus on with our guest today, Dr. Sheryl Kingsberg. Now, Dr. Kingsberg, I will just warn you, has a resume a mile long. She's a clinical psychologist, but also the division chief of OBGYN behavioral medicine at University Hospital Cleveland Medical Center. She's the co-director of sexual medicine and vulvovaginal health program at UH Cleveland Medical Center. She's a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine, and also a professor of psychiatry there. Her main research interests are in female sexual function and the psychosocial, psychological aspects of infertility and menopause. She has published widely in numerous medical journals and is actively involved in numerous medical societies, including the North American Menopause Society, and sits on the boards of several medical journals. But she's here today in her role as an expert clinical advisor to the organization Healthy Women. So without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Sheryl Kingsberg. You are in the ladies' room.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in the ladies' room.
So tell me, what was your most unique, interesting, different, or unusual experience that you ever had in a ladies' room aside from this interview?
Well, that is an interesting question. I wish I had prepared for that one.
Oh, I never give out the questions in advance.
It was probably running into a celebrity, which I will not name.
Oh, come on.
No, but it's interesting as we're talking about anxiety and in the news, but it was a politician. And it's always nice to know that that they do actually wash their hands after they use the restroom.
Well, you have a sample size of one.
I do.
So she did. But HIPAA rules only cover patients that you see. If you didn't have a patient encounter with her in the ladies' room, there's no barring from telling us who she was.
That is true. Although I will tell you that just last week, it wasn't in the ladies' room, I did run into Senator Michelle Warren on an airline, flying coach, and wonderfully warm and willing to take selfies with the people as they were coming on the plane and answer their questions. And I thought that's how you reach the people.
Right. And I know you just missed, but I think you meant Elizabeth Warren.
Yes.
We have to make sure we get the names right.
Absolutely. See, now, talk about anxiety. Here's what happens at menopause. A, you get a little anxious, and B, name recall goes away. And
Absolutely.
So as I confabulated Michelle Obama and Elizabeth Warren, wouldn't that be an interesting combination?
And I'm sure Elizabeth Warren is happy to hear that. I was worried that you were confabulating Michelle Bachmann.
Oh, no.
Warren, so we don't want to do that.
Would never mix those up.
So any kind of unusual situation we're in can trigger anxiety. And for some people, doing a media interview is very anxiety provoking. Of course, there's data about how most people feel tremendous anxiety getting up in front of a room and delivering a speech. So there's that old joke about how at a funeral, most people are so anxiety about delivering a eulogy that they would rather that it be their funeral than them the one speaking. So talk to us about some other common triggers of anxiety.
Well, besides having to be on your podcast.
And we're so warm and welcoming.
Yeah, and you are. But usually public speaking is a key one. But having to have a work project is certainly something that's a due date. And remember, we were talking about age-related differences. Mm-hmm. One of the things that creates anxiety for younger people is schoolwork, right? Mm-hmm. So they have, exams, they have, assignments. But women, as we age, we have a little bit more responsibility that creates anxiety. So often worries about children and worries about your professional career, worries about your health, because as we age, we now have to come face to face with our mortality. And so they compound on each other. And while we have control over how hard we study to do well on an exam, right? So control is a key issue. We don't always have control about what our children do, much to the chagrin of many parents.
Don't always or don't ever.
And we certainly often don't have control over the fact that we're aging. We have control over how we manage our aging and health, but we, at the end of the day, can't change the fact that we are aging. So those factors contribute. That sense of control is a big factor into how we manage anxiety, because everybody has anxiety. As you saw from the results of that survey, 96% reported that they experience anxiety, and the 4% probably just didn't know how to define it. Those either were very medicated or they really didn't know how to define it.
Well, and speaking of medication, that's a confounding variable, because as we age and as we develop various health conditions or health problems, certainly menopause is not an illness, it's a health transition and it's a phase of life, but we also develop legitimate medical problems. And many of us, and I don't even know the latest statistics on what percentage of women over 50 are on at least one medication, but it's extremely high. So talk to me about the confounding factors of medicines and what medicines are likely to cause anxiety.
Well, ironically, for women who have high blood pressure and hypertension, if they're on a beta blocker, that actually can help with their anxiety, because we know some people use beta blockers when they're giving a talk, because it lowers their heart rate and allows them to not feel as anxious.
I knew a resident, when I was in residency, one of my colleagues used to take a beta blocker whenever he was on call, just to decrease his anxiety. But that increased my anxiety, knowing that he was self-medicating just to be on call.
Right. Well, so it's a zero sum in that case, I guess. But yeah, some medications can certainly increase our anxiety. But it's also the idea of not feeling completely healthy that's more likely to make us feel anxious, not necessarily the medicines. If we feel like that's managing our health better, that doesn't necessarily have to be a negative. But you're right that the older we get, and it's not necessarily menopause, it's just about age, right? There's not a difference between a 49-year-old who still is having regular cycles and a 50-year-old who is not, in terms of what medicines she might be on, unless we're talking about hormone therapy. But hormones are an important topic because here's one of the statistics. We know that at least 1 in 5 of us are going to experience some form of an anxiety disorder in the United States at some point in our lives. But when we look at the gender difference, if we're going to define gender, in this case, as male versus female, it is twice as high in women as in men, but the range is from puberty to menopause. That's where those differences come in. So children who are at risk for anxiety, same difference between boys and girls. And as we age into our older years, it's the same rate. It's during those hormonally different years that creates that 2-to-1 ratio.
Well, I always thought men were the number one cause of anxiety in women until I had children.
Ah, there you go.
I actually was once doing a television interview on the Weekend Today show about migraine. And I was talking about family history and how family history can contribute to your migraines. And then I joked, of course, family history is a big factor in developing migraine. You get them from your children. And my son was about 5 at the time, and he was watching the show on tape later, in the old days when we had VCRs. And he said, "Mommy, who causes more anxiety, me or my sister?"
That's adorable.
So that was kind
and
of
what
cute.
did you say?
You know what I said? I said, that applies to other people, not me.
Right. Absolutely.
And I am very lucky in the child department. But of course, they always say a mother is only as happy as her saddest child. So let's backtrack for a second. For people who are listening and just joining in, tell me what's a good basic definition of anxiety that you teach your medical students?
So anxiety is simply any experience of worry or nervousness that we experience cognitively as uncertainty or almost danger. And physically, we feel it as sweating, increased heart rate. So it both has a cognitive and a physical symptomatology. Everybody experiences anxiety at some point or other. As the survey showed, many women experience it weekly, many daily, some weekly, some monthly. And those who are lucky enough to hardly ever have it, that's great. But most of us will experience it either from internal factors or external. If you're about to get hit by a bus, that would create, an anxious response.
And all the physical symptoms are all the fight or flight symptoms that we've
Absolutely.
always talked about.
It's your sympathetic nervous system sort of charging up to prepare you for danger.
So if you're about to get hit by a bus or you're about to go to the dentist, that would be acute anxiety. But and many people in the survey had acute anxiety, but there are also people who have chronic anxiety. So talk to us about the definition of chronic anxiety and what's going on there in terms of, brain chemistry, in terms of body physiology and treatment and prognosis and male versus female.
Sure. So it's what's in a name. Everybody experiences anxiety, but what defines an anxiety disorder is really about the chronic experience where it isn't just a temporal issue that happens from going to the dentist or, almost being run over, but it is chronic under almost all circumstances, right? And is debilitating. So it interferes with your life and how you manage your life. So somebody who has an anxiety disorder may not leave her house very often, or she may avoid going to certain places, if not everything, then to certain places, or maybe she won't ever go to the dentist. But it is so chronic and so overwhelming that it interferes with her life. And that is what defines an anxiety disorder. There are different kinds of anxiety disorders. For example, we have one called generalized anxiety disorder, which, is what it is. So it is that you have experience of acute anxiety in almost all situations, right? So it doesn't have to be specific. And that there is that feeling of dread, of nervousness, of worry, and that is also experienced as that increased sympathetic nervous system. The heart rate increases, there can be sweating, your fingers are cold, and that occurs over almost all situations. But there are also specific phobias, right? We might have an anxiety of, I have many friends who have fear of spiders or fear of mice. And it really is debilitating. If they happen to see a mouse in their house, they're out of there. And they're not back until they, sort of like poltergeist, this house is clean.
Fumigated.
And or even a simple spider that they would literally sort of scream and jump away. So that would be a simple phobia. We have certain things that are more likely to cause phobias than others. But then we have obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a form of an extreme anxiety disorder that is experienced as either or both obsessions, which are unremitting, uninvited thoughts, usually about something that goes against your feelings or your beliefs, and or compulsive rituals that go along with it. So, for example, a common one is, what if as I'm driving, I felt a bump. What if I accidentally, without knowing it, ran somebody over? And so off they go, they circle the block to see whether or not they hit somebody. They don't see anything, they drive away, and they say, well, but what if I missed that? And that round and round they go, having the obsession of maybe I hit somebody, the compulsion and ritual of circling around to check, and then having that immediate relief, and then the anxiety occurs again. So that could be checking to see if you've hit somebody, checking your doorknob, checking to make sure you turn the lights off, checking
Or the oven off.
Yes, which
making sure you have your cell phone.
Right, and which we all panic if have you ever been on the phone talking to somebody and think there's no phone?
Actually, and that kind of behavior also increases with age. So
yes.
The best thing I ever heard was from Professor Wong, who wrote the book, blanking on the name of my book. Why You Forget Your Keys, but don't. Welcome to Your Brain. Why You Forget Where You Put Your Keys, but Don't Forget How to Drive. And what he said is, we all forget where we put our keys. We all forget why we walked into the kitchen. So long as you don't forget what the keys are or what a kitchen is for, you're probably in good shape. But back to the OCD. Of course, a lot of people watch medical drama shows on television, and there's what I call the TV portrayal of obsessive compulsive disorder, which is always, the really extreme form. But what my pet peeve is the point that you made kind of parenthetically, that you don't have to have obsessive thoughts and the compulsive behaviors. They can be separate. You can have just one or the other and still have OCD.
Correct. And so there are certain levels of it, and some of us are more personality styles, right? So we define obsessive compulsive personality style or disorder versus obsessive compulsive disorder, and that's usually on a range. So I admire, almost envy, people who have a little bit of obsessive compulsive personality style, because their desk is always completely neat, they're organized, they get everything done, because the anxiety of not having it neat overrides the effort that is required to keep everything organized.
Well, and there's certain professions where, I want my surgeon to be very obsessive.
Right.
And a little bit compulsive.
And it's very interesting when you give a lecture to the medical students in year 1 and year 2, you can kind of see which subspecialty they're sort of leaning towards already.
Yeah, I don't want somebody who's a very creative, loosey-goosey kind of woman to be my brain surgeon. I want somebody who's very thorough and meticulous. So we're talking about a whole range of anxiety, and you got to obsessive compulsive disorder. But now talk to me about, speaking of things in the news, talk to me about PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder.
Sure. So, we think PTSD really is an anxiety disorder that occurs after having a life life-threatening event. So when you are feeling like your life or somebody nearby you is in absolute danger. So the common thought is that's what people in combat experience. They come back and the
But not
VA
all.
hospital. Correct. Not all of them will develop PTSD, but also not all PTSD is about combat. We see it all the time. For example, I work in an OBGYN department. You would not believe how many women after childbirth will have experienced PTSD, because it is sometimes a very life-threatening thing. We take it for granted. We think, oh, you know, in the US, every woman has a safe and healthy pregnancy and delivery, but not always. And so when a woman goes in expecting everything is going to be smooth, and then there is a crisis or there's a medical emergency, that in and of itself often creates PTSD. And so that's also very jarring for them, because I think, well, I wasn't in combat. How could I be experiencing those symptoms? And the symptoms are flashbacks, nightmares, feelings of panic and dread that can occur spontaneously in any situation. It doesn't have to be triggered by something, but oftentimes a smell or an image could easily re-trigger it, or a nightmares example, but it doesn't always have to be. And so it's very helpful to sort of normalize for women that anything that can create a life-threatening situation can create PTSD. Now, as you said, what's in the news? Absolutely, sexual trauma is the perfect setup for PTSD. And even if it isn't truly worrying about death, but the assault, the violation is absolutely well enough to create PTSD. Even if nothing ends up actually happening, even if a woman escapes before she is attacked, the experience of the threat
Or
is
the
enough.
fear.
Absolutely.
So what I've been talking about lately with response to people who have questions about sexual assault and who don't understand the terror of sexual assault is they say, okay, let's take us back a step. Let's drop the sexual nature. Let's just talk about if this was just plain old ordinary assault. Let's talk about if you were just beaten up by somebody who unexpectedly, who may or may not have had a weapon as well, or who was holding their hand over your mouth and nose so you couldn't breathe, or who was on top of you and pummeling you and doing things to your body that had nothing to do with a sexual nature. So, of course, people who have just been plain old ordinary assaulted could also develop PTSD, correct?
Oh, absolutely. This is, sexual assault is a additional trauma, right? It is additional, but any kind of sense of being physically in danger and violated and losing control over your free will is completely a risk factor for PTSD. I'm shocked that there aren't more people who experience it. And
I think there are, but they don't come to realize that.
Yes.
And they don't realize what maladaptive behaviors that they have developed, as a result of that. So talking about maladaptive behaviors, one of the criteria you gave for an anxiety disorder is that it interferes with their activities of daily living. And that's a very common medical phrase that we throw around all the time. And we know what it means, but I don't really think people think about the extent to which their daily activities can be interfered with by anxiety. So the number one activity of daily living that is interfered with anxiety is sleep. Which we kind of, maybe we take it for granted, or maybe we think of that as a nightly activity. So talk to me about sleep disturbances and anxiety and menopause.
Well, you've said it all. You could just go home at that. Well, we know that sleep is absolutely important for many things, but for basic health, right? And as we age, particularly postmenopausally, sleep becomes disturbed. And there are many theories about that. And I just came back from the North American Menopause Society. I have just finished my year as president. So talk about anxiety and now some relief.
Now you've graduated.
I've graduated. I am now in the has-been category, or the post.
No, the emerita category.
Yeah, that's right. So there were some wonderful lectures on sleep and menopause, and there are theories about hormonal changes and shifts that can contribute to sleep disturbance. We always assume that hot flashes really are the reason why at 3 a.m. we wake up, but in fact it may be more of a shift in hormonal balance that sort of goes with our circadian rhythm. And then once you're up, the hot flash comes. Same
Yeah, I
thing
think bladder flashes are actually the number one thing that wake me up.
Well, there, and also it's interesting because I had invited a physical therapist, Hollis Herman, to come give a talk on sexual function and pelvic floor physical therapy. But one of her comments also was, if you wake up at 3 a.m., you really need to pay attention to, because again, you're waking up and you think, oh, gonna have a hot flash, and oh, while I'm up, I may as well go to the bathroom.
Right.
But for bladder retraining, you want to make sure that you really do have to go, because otherwise you just set that habit up. However, back to sleep. Our sleep gets disturbed, and guess what? We produce our best neurochemistry with sleep. And so if we're not getting enough sleep, then our neurochemistry is off balance, and that puts us at more risk for things like anxiety and panic, because we know that serotonin, norepinephrine, all those neurochemistry, the neurotransmitters that are important for cognitive and emotional stability, can get interfered with if we're not getting enough sleep.
So I just do have to do a plug for previous episodes we've done in the ladies' room. We have had a pelvic floor physical therapist from Australia talk about all kinds of pelvic floor issues and bladder issues, including whether, waking up in the middle of the night is a good thing and bladder retraining. But we also have had the sleep doctor, Michael Bruce, as our expert guest one time, who talked about sleep disturbances. And we didn't focus on menopause. We just focused on, sleep deprivation in general. So the $1 million question to ask somebody who has all of your credentials, particularly in psychology and a combination of OBGYN, is, do you think that the sleep disturbances associated with menopause cause anxiety? Or do you think the anxiety causes the sleep disturbance? Or do you think it's a chicken and egg situation?
Well, some of it is chicken and egg, but I would say more the egg than the chicken. So I'm not sure which direction that is, but I do think that menopause will create the sleep disturbance, and that puts women at higher risk for anxiety. Right? I don't think that it's the anxiety disorder that causes the sleep disturbance, because we see that across all ages, right? It's not just postmenopausal women who have anxiety disorders. And so even younger women who don't have the hormonal shifts are experiencing panic and anxiety, which is where cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia comes in. A wonderful lecture on CBTI, which is an internet-based cognitive behavior therapy for insomnia, because not everybody has access to a cognitive behavioral therapist near them. So there are some nice ways to have a much more broad awareness and availability of treatments, and they actually have evidence-based data to show that they are very useful. But that's across the board for all ages, that insomnia is not specific to just postmenopausal women, and anxiety can keep people up, but it's really about the waking up in the middle of the night.
So do you think the waking up, I mean, obviously there's all kinds of factors, and I always talk about intrinsic versus extrinsic factors. If it's your neighbor's dog barking, there's really nothing I can do about that. But as far as the intrinsic factors, talk more about how HRT influences that. HRT, we're talking about all hormones. We're talking about pills, patches, creams, inserts. We're kind of lumping them all together for the purpose of this discussion.
So hormone therapy, or HT, can be very helpful for many women who do have a noticeable shift in their sleep cycle, because it will modulate their hormonal rhythm. And so, we think about there certainly is not an indication for sleep for hormone therapy. It is usually for vasomotor symptoms, but given that hot flashes and night sweats can also wake you up, it does make sense. So for many women, they will say, when I started hormone therapy, my sleep got much, much better. But it's not necessarily, it's not one size fits all. So you really need to talk to your healthcare provider to say, well, here are my symptoms. Here's where they started, because, for some people, they may have anxiety or insomnia or sleep disturbances that are not related to hormones, and you want to make sure you don't lump everybody together. So if you can follow, say, a sleep diary and start to pay attention to what are the triggers. Is it your neighbor? Is it that you're drinking, caffeine? Is it that you're drinking wine? Because although we know that alcohol can make you sleepy, it really interferes with sleep architecture. So following some basic sort of information about what kind of things you're doing to help or hinder your sleep, then you sit down with your healthcare provider and you decide what might be a treatment option for you. And hormones for many may really help. And for others, there may be other medicines to consider, or even simply lifestyle changes and changing some habits.
And what habits are those?
Well, the same thing of, how much are you drinking? What's the volume you're drinking at a certain point in time at night, so that you aren't more likely to wake up having to go to the bathroom? What's the amount of caffeine you're taking in after 2 p.m. because you really want to reduce that. I don't know what time it is where you are, but it's it's 12:30 here, so whoever is in my time zone has 90 more minutes to drink a cup of coffee. We're done.
See, and I never thought it was that early. I thought I was good till 5 p.m.
No, although it's 5 o'clock somewhere, that's the glass of wine. And that also, you want to limit the amount of alcohol, because again, certain things, even benzodiazepines that we take, or anti-anxiety that we take to help relax us if we're anxious, also can interfere with sleep hygiene. So it's a very, with our sleep architecture. So it's actually a fine balance of what we take to fall asleep, to stay asleep, because there are short-acting things like the brand name Sonata that helps with getting you to sleep and is short-acting, versus something like Ambien, which will then help keep you asleep for 8 hours, versus the things like Ativan or Xanax, which are really anti-anxiety, that if you find yourself super anxious, tend to interfere with your sleep architecture. So we actually use things like trazodone for sleep because it doesn't interfere with your sleep architecture nearly as much, and allows you to get the kind of sleep that you're going to need to get into deep sleep, to be able to have REM sleep. So alcohol actually interferes with that. So if you think you're taking a drink, which many, many women do, they think, well, I'll just take a drink and it'll help me sleep, but it backfires, and then it starts to spiral.
And it also makes you have to pee.
Yeah, and it has calories.
Right, absolutely. So, and it decreases your willpower about eating other calories.
That's right.
But talk to me about, one of the things we always talk about, mixed conditions. So people taking multiple medications, people having multiple factors, but also there are women who have a combination of anxiety and depression. So we think of those two things as exactly opposite, and yet what percentage of women have actually a mixed anxiety, depression kind of situation?
Well, I would say the majority of women who experience depression will also have some form of anxiety. And I'll give you a prime example, which is postpartum depression.
Mm-hmm.
So I see an awful lot of postpartum depression, and there are really two flavors of anxiety, and there's two of a panic disorder or panic attack, which we'll talk about in a minute, and two flavors for postpartum depression. There's a really flat depression where there's no ability to engage, which is really very serious, because the impact on offspring of not having that connection with your primary caregiver is tremendous in terms of long-term development. Then there's an anxious postpartum depression, which is way more obsessive compulsive. There's lots of what if thinking, and they think, am I going crazy? Because there's usually what ifs about hurting the baby, which has nothing to do with their desire to hurt the baby, but their worst fears come realized.
Right. Obviously, all new mothers double check whether the baby's still breathing, or whether whether they're sleeping, and those kinds of things.
And that's normal anxiety, but the postpartum depression level is, what if I go crazy or forget or lose control. It's their worst fear. That is, they have lost themselves. They're never going to do it. It's women who have a psychotic depression who aren't really as worried about it that we worry about. But women who are like, what if, it is more OCD-like, and it makes them, feel horrible. And that is an anxiety disorder, and we certainly can treat that. Same thing with panic attacks. We were talking about panic attacks a little bit
So
earlier.
define what a panic attack is.
Panic attack is that experience in the moment of extreme dread, that is that there's something that is about to befall you that will either be death or essentially losing your mind. There are two flavors to it.
Mm-hmm.
That there's impending doom is a panic attack, and it comes on suddenly. It tends not to last very long, but it is horrible when it happens. And there are essentially two flavors to it. One is, I am going to die, and so heart rate goes up, and these are women or men that will show up in the emergency room thinking they're having a heart attack or a stroke. I am feeling so out of control, I think I'm going to die. Or the other flavor is, what if I go crazy? What if I'm in public? What if I, throw up? What if I pass out? What if I say something crazy? That's the panic attack of going crazy. So two flavors. They're both about impending doom and dread. They create the sympathetic response of dread, terror, heart rate increased, and fortunately, they don't last very long. They last a few minutes. And I will always tell patients,
forever.
Oh, that feels like forever, but it doesn't last. By definition, a panic attack has to be an attack, not a chronic experience. They can have chronic exposure to having panic attacks many times, but the attack itself is short-lived. And one of the things that I will tell patients is, the bad news is you had a horrible panic attack. The good news is you will never have as bad a one as you had the first time, because now you will know what it is and you get through it, but you can talk to yourself about, this is a panic attack. This is only a panic attack. As bad as it feels, it will not kill me. I really am not going crazy. I'm not having a heart attack, and it does end.
Well, and hopefully you'll learn things to do to take care of that. We always talk about the breathing into a brown paper bag. Hopefully
Sure.
You'll also learn to call a therapist or, your physician and make an appointment and have that evaluated. I want to circle back to postpartum depression for a second, though, because one of the things I've always been very impressed by is the percentage of women who think that menopause in and of itself is a risk factor for depression. And we know that menopause in and of itself is not a risk factor for depression. However, there are women who have pre-existing risk factors that do increase their risk for, excuse me, I'm getting all choked up about it, that do increase their risk for subsequent depression. And of course, having had previous postpartum depression is one of them. What are the other risk factors for depression after menopause?
There is a subgroup of women for whom the hormonal shifts that can occur during your menstrual cycle, so premenstrual dysphoric disorder, during pregnancy, because just as many women will develop a depression or an anxiety disorder during pregnancy as postpartum, so that's about 10 to 15%, and postpartum about 10%. All of those are about the shifts in your hormonal milieu. And so for those women, it really is hormones, and that also puts women at risk at menopause. It's not menopause itself, but it is the shift in hormonal changes, and not the post-menopause period that is the danger zone. And so for those women, if they know they've had those experiences during their menstrual cycle or postpartum, that they can talk to their healthcare provider about maybe we should keep an eye out for this, but not everybody. So it's, there's some women who are going to breeze through all of those experiences, including menopause, and not bat an eye. So it's not a one size fits all. We also know neurochemically, some women are going to be at risk for a depression or an anxiety disorder that has nothing to do with hormones at all. That, family history will determine that, or just other prior experiences. Some are going to be situationally triggered by, trauma, or, having difficulties within one's life. So there are many things that are risk factors and triggers hormones is one, for some women, not all.
Right. And we talk about medical comorbidities or other medical problems you can have at the same time. And then I always put thyroid disorders in a separate, its own privileged category when I'm talking about menopause and anxiety and depression, because thyroid disorders tend to appear in much greater numbers when we're about menopausal age. In fact, it's even a recommendation that all people be screened for thyroid disorders at age 60. And of course, I love your expression that things come in two flavors. So thyroid disorders generally come in two flavors: overactive thyroid and underactive thyroid. And in general, most of the symptoms of an overactive thyroid or hyperthyroidism are very similar to the symptoms of anxiety. And most of the symptoms of an underactive thyroid are very similar to the symptoms of depression.
Yes.
So what do you want to say about thyroid?
Well, I love it because it is one of the simple things to have measured. You can just get some labs, and any healthcare provider should be measuring thyroid function right away, because otherwise you're treating the wrong thing. And we see that a lot in lots of conditions.
And it's easy to treat, but it's easily missed.
Absolutely.
And I'm always staggered when people miss that diagnosis, because every time I had a patient with something, in this category, or every time even in myself, every time I gain 10 pounds, I secretly hope I have a thyroid disorder.
Exactly. I was just going to say that. Most of my patients are like, oh, please let it be my thyroid so that I can, lose some weight.
A nice, easily treated thyroid disorder. I don't know how this person is breaking through all of my technological mechanisms to turn off the phone calls.
Well, they must be very anxious to speak to you.
Yes, and seeing who it is, I'm guessing that is true. But we still have so much else to cover. And of course, we could talk about this topic all day. I don't want to be remiss in failing to circle back to medications. Because we didn't talk about just some really common things that are physiologic that can trigger anxiety in a lot of people. So for starters, talk to me about caffeine, which is my favorite drug of choice.
Well, caffeine certainly has as a benefit its ability to sort of rev up your nervous system, and that's why we use it, to kind of keep us awake. But on the other hand, it then can stir up all of the physiologic symptoms that we can experience as anxious and anxiety. And so it's interesting, if you snuck some caffeine into somebody's drink and did not tell them that they were about to drink caffeine, they might get pretty anxious. Why am I feeling that little bit of a caffeine buzz? And that kind of triggers anxiety. And we do know that it does stay in our system longer than we expect. And so back to my rule, which is no caffeine after 2:00. No caffeine after 2:00.
And I've talked to many people who are very sensitive about caffeine and coffee, who will often ask for decaf after dinner at a restaurant, but accidentally be given caffeinated coffee. And those people really are, very fun to party with. Let's talk about, we're getting into cough, cold, allergy, flu season. So let's talk about some really common drugs in that category that can cause anxiety. So number one offender, Sudafed.
Yes, which you now have to get. You have to ask for it behind the counter.
You have to show more ID to get Sudafed than you do to buy ammunition.
That's right. So yes, absolutely. It's important that everybody knows that you need to take it in the morning. If you're going to take your Sudafed, if you try to take it at night, you're going to be up all night. And so you can say, well, do I stay up all night with a stuffy nose and a cough, or do I stay up all night because I'm buzzed with that pseudoephedrine? It acts as a stimulant. And so it's really something for everybody to read the labels, take your, the non-drowsy formula for when you want to be awake, and sometimes you take it, I've seen people take Benadryl to help them sleep. So
Benadryl is another pet peeve of mine because it's not a sleep medication. Benadryl has a really long half-life. So, and also most women who take Benadryl actually need half the dose as most men. But Benadryl can give you a real hangover in the morning. And
sure
what are
can.
most people doing in the morning? Driving. Yeah, there's
Right.
another thing we commonly say to people without really explaining what we mean. Every one of those medications has something on it that says, do not operate heavy machinery. And every comedian at some point has said, what do you think? I'm out, plowing the fields with a tractor when I'm taking this medication? No, you're driving a car, which is heavy machinery. And that's, it can have the same effect as having had 2 drinks. And of course, you don't want to wash down any of these medications with your caffeinated coffee or your Diet Coke. And similarly, you don't want to wash them down with a glass of wine. So,
No, you
that's
don't.
anyway, we can go on and on all day. The whole
Well,
issue of
how
medication.
about just reminding everybody they should get a flu shot? That would be part of the help.
Awesome. I was going to ask you, what's the most important thing we didn't talk about yet?
Well, besides the flu shot, I think it's about talking to your healthcare provider if you are anxious, because here's the thing that came from that survey that was very telling. The majority of women that experience anxiety would never even think to report it to their physician, nurse practitioner. They just don't think about it. It is something which is actually very similar to menopausal symptoms or genitourinary syndrome of menopause. It's just something they think they're supposed to learn to live with, because everybody gets anxiety, but the fact is
Especially
that when
these stressful times.
yes, so why
But
should
would
I
say,
be any different?
just because it's common doesn't mean it's normal. And just because it is common and complex doesn't mean it's not treatable.
Exactly. And sometimes going from subclinical anxiety, which is not enough to kind of cross that threshold to be defined as an anxiety disorder, but when it becomes debilitating, that's when somebody finally will get help and they'll think, wow, the last 50 years I've lived with this sort of subclinical anxiety that I didn't really need to live with, because now they've gotten some treatment. They can go to cognitive behavior therapy. They learn how to think differently about their world and their anxiety. And sometimes it actually does them a favor when they cross that threshold into actually needing help, because now it helps, because we all have anxiety. We all have sort of misperceptions about how we think about the world. So it's not that every single person needs therapy, but most of us could benefit from a session or two.
Or tune up in difficult situations.
That's right.
And I think, I really want to underscore, there are a lot of people who say they don't want to talk to their doctor about XYZ symptom, whether it's anxiety or many other conditions, because they'll say they don't want to be given medication. Well, first of all, no doctor is going to force you to do something that you don't want to do, or hopefully not try to.
Mm-hmm.
But also, you kind of snuck in there about cognitive behavioral therapy and talk therapy, which is really just as important or sometimes more important than any kind of medication in terms of treating anxiety.
So since you liked my 2-flavor approach, let me use another concept that I think is really helpful to for people to understand. It is a big word, but it makes sense. I think anxiety, depression is best understood from a biopsychosocial perspective. Right? There are biologic factors that contribute to anxiety or depression, right? Your hormones, neurochemistry, or your neurotransmitters, all of those, or your basic health, right? Or the medicines you're on. All of those things can contribute to anxiety problems. But also psychologically, if you already are prone to anxiety or have a family history of depression, or you have psychological factors hitting you, they can contribute to anxiety. Interpersonal factors, if you are about to get divorced, or you're having relationship conflicts or work conflicts, interpersonal struggles, that can create anxiety.
Although in many cases, getting divorced can treat anxiety.
That's right.
Not that I'm talking about my divorce.
Of course not. But the process of it is always hard. Even when it's the right thing to do, I will see many women who will say, the process of getting the divorce was really stressful, and that should not make you think, well, does that mean I shouldn't have gotten divorced? No, it's the process. It's not the end result.
The process.
But interpersonal factors and also sociocultural factors, right? What's happening in our Me Too, experience right now. all of those factors contribute to anxiety and depression. So we look at all four as potentially contributing, and we think which one is causing the most distress and harm right now, and that guides treatment, right? So if it is how we think about things, if it's our situations, then guess what? Cognitive behavior therapy probably would be a really good fit for you. For others, if there is a neurochemical imbalance and you have a family history of it and you have episodes of anxiety or depression, or hormonally there's a shift, a pharmacologic or hormone treatment might be the best thing. Or sometimes it's a combination. Using medicine and psychotherapy together sometimes provides the most optimal treatment. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Sitting down with a healthcare provider that you like and trust can help you determine which direction you should go.
All right. So, in medicine, we're always complaining about the doorknob question, which is like we've had the discussion, we've talked about everything. And then just as the patient's hand is on the doorknob and leaving to go, they ask the most important question. So the most important question for our listeners that we haven't talked about, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes before we do let you go, is talk to me about empty nest syndrome.
Okay. Well, the joke is really, it's not when children leave home that women get depressed. It's when they move back in. Right? That's
the boomerang effect.
Yeah. So it's a myth that was established, a generation ago, that women would develop this melancholia because they had no purpose in life anymore. And I will tell you that because we're now in October, so kids went off to college about a month ago, and I did have two women come in literally in the same day, bereft, because even though they had children left at home, they really felt the emptiness and the sadness of this child moving on. They were happy for him or her and thrilled about their life moving forward, but they felt some sadness. So I don't want to dismiss it as non-existent, but it does not trigger an anxiety disorder or depression. That would be a mild grief response, a sadness, a homesickness, if you will, reversed.
Sort of like the baby blues.
Yeah, it is not a disorder. It's a normal experience, and women feel guilty because they think, well, I want my child to fly away and succeed, but at the same time I feel a little sadness. Normal.
I think that's really important. And I am going to end with asking you how people can find you on social media.
Well, I actually do have a Twitter handle. It's Sheryl Kingsberg at, I think, but I'm not even sure.
At Sheryl Kingsberg.
At Sheryl Kingsberg. There you go.
And Cheryl's with an S, so everybody knows.
Yes.
And
so
also people can send me questions and I can forward them on to you. Or, we always have a discussion once a week on Wednesdays with our Facebook live show, Ask Dr. Donica, where we address a lot of the questions that come up on these podcasts. But I want to thank you so much. We covered a lot of material. This is certainly a huge topic, and it's going to come up again and again and again in different ways and forms. But I really want to thank you so much for coming in the ladies' room to share with us the kind of inside scoop and your tremendous insight on anxiety in women, particularly after menopause. So thank you again.
Thank you for having me. And my, heart goes out to Elizabeth Warren, who I screwed up. And
she listens to our podcast every time. I've been trying to get her on as a guest. So if she's listening to this episode, have your people call my people and we'll work it out.
I grew up in Massachusetts. And so although I live in Cleveland now, I would have been thrilled for her to be my senator. So
I think she's a fabulous senator. I also did make an open invitation in a previous episode, but since you brought it up, I did invite all women who are politicians who are running for office to have their people call my people, and they have an open invitation to be guests on our podcast. So they can talk about not only their personal medical stories, as we did. We had Lisa Mandelblatt talking about her journey with having had thyroid cancer, which actually partially motivated her to run for office because of all of the insurance issues and getting an inside view of our healthcare delivery system with you, which you and I know is extremely complicated. Who knew it was so complicated? But I've invited all women who are running for office because they are running as though our health depends on it, which it really kind of does.
It really does.
So I think it's time for us to let the cat out of the bag, that politics is integrally involved with our individual health and certainly the health of our nation. So I will make that offer again to women and men of good conscience who want to talk about healthcare issues and public policy, as well as their personal medical stories.
Great.
So thank you again.
An honor to have been invited on, and thank you very much.
And you didn't even have to run for office to get invited. Although you finished your term as president of North American Menopause.
That's right. That's right. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
That's all we have time for today. But let's keep the conversation going on Twitter or Facebook at Dr. Donica. And please join us next week for another episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. Real conversations with real women about really intimate topics.